The federal government continues its fight against climate change with a number of bills and proposals. Some say this is making for great progress. Others believe it's highly ineffective. Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Ross McKittrick, a professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Dr. McKittrick, thank you so much for joining me today via Skype from Guelph.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely. Now, you wrote an article in the Financial Post on the proposed federal CFS, or Clean Fuel Standard. Can you tell us what exactly the Clean Fuel Standard requires from us?
Well, the standard is it's not directed at ordinary air pollution. It's directed at trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is released from the fuel being burned. And the only way you can really do that is to blend in various forms of biofuels. So it'll mean blending in more ethanol into gasoline and biogas into natural gas. And the hope is that on a life cycle or an engineering basis, there's less carbon dioxide emissions from that blended fuel. The effect of this will be, because these are more expensive fuel streams, biogas and ethanol are more expensive to produce than regular fuel, it will raise the cost of fuels. Depending on how stringent the target is, one estimate from the Canadian Energy Research Institute is that the price of natural gas could be pushed up by about 60% to fully comply with this rule. They may not push it that far. It's still a bit hard to tell, but it'll also add probably 5 to 10 cents per liter to the price of gasoline. And the effect of this, the government hopes they will reduce national carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by about 30 megatons, which would get us partway to the Paris climate target, but certainly wouldn't be enough to get us there.
Right. So although the term biofuel may sound good because it requires fertilizer, water, and land to produce, that process itself can increase pollution. And some say it costs more in energy to produce than you would actually end up saving. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, that is right. If you start with, for instance, a crop of corn, to turn it into ethanol is a very energy-intensive process. And a lot of it is actually done in the United States, where they use electricity from a very fossil fuel-intensive electricity grid. So that's why when we look at the actual emission reduction from switching to ethanol, you have to look at it on this life cycle basis. And if it's in the end, if it's actually the case that you get lower emissions from ethanol, it's not lower by much. It's lower at the tailpipe level, but it's on the life cycle basis. Some estimates are that depending on where you get the ethanol from, we actually would increase total emissions.
Okay, so the whole point of the Clean Fuel Standard is to reduce carbon emissions from the use of fossil fuels. But we already have a carbon tax that's being imposed. So why do we also need the CFS forced upon producers and consumers?
Yeah, that's a good question. The rationale for the carbon tax is it gives everybody a financial incentive to find the cheapest way possible to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. In economics, we like those kinds of policies because then you can say, all right, we're going to agree on how much emission reduction we're going to achieve. This is the way to do it at the lowest possible cost. But that only works if then the government stands back and lets the system work. If they let the market find those solutions under the incentive of the carbon tax. What they're doing here is actually undermining the carbon tax because they're saying to the fuel producers and the fuel users, all right, you still have to pay the carbon tax, but we're also going to add this extra set of rules. Specifically, you have to blend in all these biofuels into the liquid and gas stream. And it's happening at a much higher cost than the cost of complying with the carbon tax. So they've really unraveled the efficiency aspect of the carbon tax doing it this way, but of course they're still requiring us to pay it.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like an economically feasible plan, but will it actually make a difference? Will it reduce carbon emissions significantly, especially as our population continues to grow and demand for fuel continues as well?
Um, there's a conflict between the goal of reaching the Paris targets and holding our emissions permanently below the target level, and also trying to increase the workforce much more rapidly than we've done in the past. And the government's trying to pursue both goals at once. The reality is that the population growth that they have in mind over the next few years will more than offset any of the reductions from the clean fuel standard. We ran into this problem with the Kyoto Protocol many years ago. A lot of people have forgotten all about that, but the government of the day signed a treaty in Kyoto promising to get our emissions down by a fairly ambitious amount and keep them down after 2010. And then it just turned out to be very expensive to do that because the technology isn't available that would let us use fossil fuels the way we do in a large, cold, spread out country like we have. We can't use fossil fuels to run our cars and heat our homes and get emissions down by the amount that they promised. So we ended up abandoning the Kyoto commitment. We're going to run into the same problem with Paris, that the government they can put these policies forward. They're very expensive to try. In the end, they don't actually accomplish what the government hopes that they will. And so something's got to give at the end of the day.
Why is net zero so important to the government? Why do we have to get there regardless of costs? Carbon dioxide in and of itself isn't a pollutant. Is it not, in fact, very necessary for a healthy planet?
Well, yeah, carbon dioxide has never been regulated in the past because it's not a local air contaminant. We regulate carbon monoxide and particulates and sulfur dioxide and other forms of local air pollution. But we didn't used to regulate carbon dioxide because, as you say, it is a natural part of the atmosphere and it's essential for plant life. What's happening now, though, is with fossil fuel consumption, that does release carbon dioxide emissions. And the concern is that over the long term, that can have an effect on the climate. And so the idea of going to net zero carbon dioxide emissions, which is a far more radical target even than the Paris Accord targets, the government seems to have adopted that without much in the way of a discussion with the public about why we need to do that, how much it would cost, and whether there would even be any benefits of doing it. And even though they pushed the deadline forward into the future, they are already proposing, like the clean fuel standard, some policies that if they go ahead with them, they will be very expensive for people. And I think people deserve a better accounting from the government about why it is that they think this is so important to do and just how much they expect people to pay.
Interesting. Now, green activists argue that clean energy will be an economic boost to Canada, and we shouldn't worry about the fossil fuel industry ending because we can quickly replace it with green energy. So, how realistic is that?
It's not at all realistic. I've been hearing the same thing now for 20 years or more. Every time the government proposes one of these policies, you will have environmentalists and also sometimes the representatives of the renewable fuels industry or the wind energy industry coming along and saying, don't worry, there'll be lots of jobs in these new sectors. Typically, though, for instance, our experience in Ontario going the green energy route, they said it wouldn't affect electricity prices, but the reality was our prices more than doubled. And they said that it would create a lot of new jobs. And the reality was that because of the increased electricity prices and the loss of manufacturing that went along with that, we lost at least 2 jobs for every job that was created in the renewable energy sector. And then the renewable energy sector jobs are only temporary anyway. Once the turbines are built and the solar panels are built, there aren't really ongoing jobs in that sector. So it is not the case that green energy is an economic opportunity. If it was an economic opportunity, you wouldn't need to force people to do it. The market would just pursue the opportunity the way people pursue any other profitable opportunity. The reason we have these policies is precisely because the market realizes these are money-losing industries and they don't create jobs.
Interesting point. Now, you point out also that we all want clean fuel, but apparently, for every dollar of environmental benefit from the CFS, we actually lose $6 of income and wealth. Can you explain
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, so that comes from tallying up the costs of compliance with the regulation and then also the indirect cost to the rest of the economy from the higher fuel prices and the reduction in the value of investments and things like that. And then, so you have that on one side of the ledger. And then on the other side, we look at, well, what are the benefits of reducing the emissions? And right now, the government sets the carbon tax rate based on scientific estimates of what is the benefit of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And so if we take the maximum value from that schedule and we say, okay, we'll value the emission reductions using the government's own estimate, then it turns out the costs of the policy are 6 times larger than the benefits. So we can say, yeah, we'll take the government at its word that these emission reductions are valuable, but that's not the end of the story. We are incurring much larger costs to get those emission reductions. And going back to the point of the carbon tax, one of the essential pieces of logic of the carbon tax is it says we'll pursue emission reductions, but only up to the point where the the costs of further reductions end up costing more than the benefits. And that's why we initially would go with a carbon tax type policy, because then it ensures that you don't get into a situation like we are in with the clean fuel standard where we're getting emission reductions, but the costs are far in excess of the benefits.
Now, the federal government also recently tabled new legislation, Bill C-12, that would force current and future federal governments to set binding climate targets to get Canada to net zero carbon by 2050. Any thoughts on what this means for Canadians? Should we be concerned about potential increases in taxes? And what about the impact this might have on things like the cost of gas, groceries, home heating, and anything we purchase?
Yeah, these are all valid concerns because in order to accomplish the goal, you have to make energy a lot more expensive. There's just no way you can function in a country like Canada without using energy. And if you are going to get people to use less energy, you have to make it more expensive. Now, the legislation, um, it's a bit tricky for one government to say they're going to bind all future governments to this plan. Really, all a government can do is bind itself to a plan, but they can't pass a law today that every government from now on is bound by, because a future government can always repeal the legislation if they want. I think the concern that's raised here, though, is just it signals that the current government is absolutely determined to pursue this path, and they are not particularly concerned about how much it's going to cost people, and they're not really listening to that side of the story.
Is anyone thinking about how excessive spending on climate change is impacting other areas where tax dollars would be put to much better use? Like maybe healthcare, education, fighting crime, reducing poverty. The list could go on.
Um, well, we think about that sort of thing in the economics profession. I don't think it's nearly prominent enough in the discussion. So going back to the green energy example in Ontario, because of these very high electricity prices, the government has said they're going to help some of our manufacturing and industry groups with lower electricity prices by transferring the cost of some of those expensive green energy contracts onto the taxpayer, basically putting it into the government budget. And that's going to be $3 to $3.5 billion per year just to get the burden off the manufacturing sector for the electricity costs. Now you think about what that means. That's a pharmacare program that we're not able to have because the money is going to cover these contracts. That's services for families with disabled children. That's upgrading hospitals in smaller communities. That's a lot of things that aren't going to happen because we are paying for contracts for electricity that we could have got much cheaper. We didn't need to pay that money in the first place. It's wasted money. And with something like the clean fuel standard, you're asking people to pay maybe 50 or 60% more for the same natural gas that they were getting previously. And you have to ask for what? And that's money out of household budgets. That's going to mean money out of farm budgets that they have to pass on to consumers in higher food prices. Yes, these are all absolutely legitimate questions. And the sad thing, as far as I can see, is that no, the government is not particularly interested in these questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. McKittrick, for your insight. Dr. Ross McKittrick, professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.